Once upon a time, there was a young soldier who returned to the shores of America from the jungles of Vietnam. In the city where he found himself discharged, he had no friends and no family, and he found the people in that place did not like his kind. As he walked upon the streets, the women would turn and spit upon his uniform. The children, dressed in rainbows that seemed to live and flock in the parks, turned away their faces, and he spent many long nights in the county jail for bloodying a man after being called a baby killer as they sat drinking. And his life continued in this way, the alcohol filling the nights, and he began to spiral down and down until he sat with the old men on the benches in the park who mumbled to themselves, passing forth that bottle of wine and the coiling red serpents that churned inside him. And soon enough he joined them. He found a place beneath a little bridge where he made his home. But it was not sleep he often found there, for when he did sleep, he felt the green pressing back around him, the jungle pressing in close, the hum of the bullets around his ears, and the screams of the dying that worked their way out of his lips until he sat shivering in the darkness. And as Christmas came on that first year, he found himself many nights walking the paths of the park, trying to keep himself awake each night, not wanting to return to dreams. And there was one night, beneath the light of a full moon, he walked those paths till he came to a crossroads by a little unfrozen pool. And he looked down into that pool, and the man that looked back up at him was not a man he remembered. His clothes were worn, his boots ragged. His hair and beard had grown in, and around his eyes was a heaviness. For he had done his duty. He had done it well in the jungle, but what he had done weighed heavy upon his heart and in his soul and around his eyes. And as he sat smoking cigarette after cigarette, he heard the crunch of snow behind him, and he turned to see a well-dressed man in tailored slacks with a long green wool coat, slicked back, black hair, olive skin, and eyes that sparkled in the moonlight like a cat's. And the stranger looked him up and down before saying, "May I bum a smoke?" And the soldier tapped one out and handed it to the stranger, who took it. But as the man clasped it, it seemed the end began to smolder of its own accord. And the stranger took in the smoke and breathed it out again, and then he began to sniff the air, looking the soldier up and down, saying, "Well, I can always smell a desperate man." The soldier turned, looking the stranger up and down as well, saying, "I always figured folk only met the devil in fairy tales. And if I was going to meet him, it would have been in Nam." And the devil, for it was truly the devil, looked the soldier in the eyes, saying, "Oh, then let us pretend that this is a fairy tale, and I shall offer you the kind of deals that devils offer men in fairy tales." "What? For my immortal soul? You'll get it soon enough." "Well, you see," said the devil, "my cup runneth over from the souls of soldiers, filled with blood and murder and rape. No, I have had enough of that for now. Let us make this more interesting. You look cold. Take my coat. Wear my coat for 7 years. And in that time, do not wash your hands or face. Do not cut your hair or beard. Do not trim your nails. And if, in all that time, you do not suffer some accident, as it was, when you are done, I will see you satisfied for all your life. And in answer to the question you will ask next, if there is anything you need in all that time, you have but to reach into the pockets of my coat, and it shall be yours." Well, the soldier looked down at his clothes, the dirt beneath his nails, at his ragged boots, and he took the coat from the devil's hands. He put it round his shoulders, and he reached down into its pockets. And when he pulled his hands out, in one hand was his crumpled $10 bill, and in the other was a bottle of wine. And he slipped them back in the coat, and he reached out his hand and shook the devil's finely manicured fingers. And the devil smiled. He waved his cigarette in goodbye, saying, "I will be seeing you around." And he disappeared into the darkness. Well, the soldier soon found that the devil's words were true. For though he tried to pull the coat from off his shoulders, it would not come. And though he plunged his hands into running water, the dirt would not wash away. But the devil was as good as his word. For if he reached his hands down into those pockets, it was money, it It was food, it was ever he wished that he pulled forth. And so he set about doing that which did his money harm. He ate at the finest restaurants, he drank the finest wine, he kept the finest company. But soon enough, the devil's words began to tell, for the coat grew stained with dirt and snow, with oil and dust, and soon enough the company was not so good, and soon enough the restaurants would not let him enter, and soon enough he could not stay but one night in any hotel before they began to look at him askew at the dirt that he left behind him in his tracks and the smell that began to emanate from him. And as the year passed and the second drew on, he found himself sitting with the children dressed in rainbows in the parks, reaching deep into his pockets, pulling out little squares of paper on which were liquid dreams, and the acid took him long and far, but always he returned, always he came back, and always sleep finally pushed its way into his mind, and when it did, the green pressed close around him, the hum of the helicopter rotors, the ping of bullets through the jungle leaves, and the screams of children that rent their way out of his throat, and he found himself shivering in the dark beneath the bridge he again began to call home. And as the second year passed, and the third grew on, he found that the children dressed in rainbows found him too distasteful now, his screams and his smell driving them away. And so he returned to the old men, and the bottles of wine from which he pulled out his pockets, why, it made his way for a long time. But they too finally turned away their faces, could not stand him, for he had grown hulking, his beard and hair tangled and thick with grease and dirt, the mud building up on him that he could not wash away. And as that third year drew on and the fourth, he found himself in solitude that wrapped itself closer than the coat around his shoulders. And he turned to the drink, seeking blackness in the wine. But it was many nights he woke from the blackness, vomiting it out, and one night looking down into the water that ran beneath his bridge, the man he saw looking back terrified even him. For the vomit was caked in his matted beard, and his hands shook, and he looked down at the green coat that he wore, and he spat out the wine, he spat out the devil's name, and he swore he would not drink again lest the devil win. And it was many long nights he spent shivering for the want of the wine, but when it had passed, he found the nights long and quiet, and the solitude drawing around him almost unbearable. Many long nights looking down into the water, wondering perhaps there was a better place to sleep, reaching down deep into the pocket of the coat, drawing out the Colt 45, the metal biting into it with his teeth, and he fought many a long night with that trigger. And many's the night he cursed the devil's name and spat at his coat, but he did not give in. And as the years drew on, it was the fifth Christmas that had come and gone, and the snow lay heavy around his bridge, and one night he returned from his rambles in the park to see a man standing there looking down into the water, and by the hunched shoulders of the man and his vacant eyes, the soldier recognized the expression and the man he had seen cast up many times from the water. And at the crunch of his feet in the snow, the man turned, and the soldier dug a cigarette out. As the man seemed not to startle at his strange appearance, he lit it, offering it to the stranger, saying, "Smoke?" And the man took it in trembling hands, and as he breathed out the smoke, so came his story. His life had been good. He had a lovely wife, 3 amazing daughters, 1 in high school, 2 in college, a little bed and breakfast that they ran. Things were perfect. But then his wife had grown ill. The bills had piled one atop the other. The money had grown short. They had to mortgage the business. The girls had returned from school to help them. And then the bills piled higher still until he had begun to borrow money from the wrong people. And then, just before Christmas, his wife had died. And it was as hollow a Christmas as he had ever known. And then the men in dark suits had begun to threaten not only him, but his daughters as well. And he did not know what to do. The water, it looked inviting, and perhaps the life insurance, it would pay for all and see the mob settled. And the soldier, he began to laugh. He began to laugh, a rusty, hollow, unused laugh that came grating up out of his throat, and the man stepped back, startled, but the soldier only held up his hand, reaching deep into his pockets, counting out the $10 bills before the man, saying, "You tell me when." And the man's eyes grew big, thinking it was a joke. And then they grew wider still, realizing it was not, and then the tears began to flow. And he took the soldier by the hand, shaking it, weeping, stammering, looking around himself with clear eyes for the first time, seeing the strange, hulking form of the man before him, but seeing the cardboard and ragged blankets, the little stove that the soldier called home. The man, glancing around, said, You sleep here?" "I do." "Well, as I said, I run a business. Please come. Please, we have no guests now. Please come and stay with us, at least the winter through. It is all I could do for you. There is no way I can pay you back, but please let me offer you something." And though he protested, the man pleaded with him and finally took him by the arm and led him from the park. And they got into his car and they drove down fine, beautiful streets to a little 2-story brick building that seemed to sag from the weight of the winter. And in the back door they went to where the man's 3 daughters sat at the table, wondering where their father was. And they smiled to see their father come in, but then their faces changed, seeing what followed after him, the soldier pushing his way in through the door, leaving behind him a track of mud and the smell that rolled off him, striking them as if in force. The youngest daughter screamed and ran from the room, the eldest standing, and when the silence had held too long, she looked at her father, saying, This is the clientele you bring us now?" before storming from the room. But it was the middle daughter that watched her father pull the money from his pockets, and stammering, trying to explain that however unlikely this man was their strange savior. And she went to the stove and ladled him out a bowl of soup and put it on the table, and the soldier ate. And that night he slept on a mattress for the first time in years. And though the sheets were soft and the blankets warm, he found the green pressing in around him, the stink of the napalm burning his nose, the screams of children rending their way out of his throat, until he sat shivering in the darkness and he heard the whispers in the hallway outside. And he put his back to the wall, and all that night he willed himself awake. And when morning came, none of the 4 would meet his eyes at breakfast. When they were done, he called to his host, and outside they spoke, and he said, "My friend, for all that my money can do for you, my screams, they will destroy your business quicker than all of that. I will be going." And though his host protested, he said no. But finally the man looked around him, saying, Please, there has to be a way. There has to be a way. I can give you something in recompense. It seems insulting, but we have a little shed. I could clean it out. I have extra beds and a little stove. I could make for you there some sort of little house. Please, let me give you something. And the soldier agreed. And the man was as good as his word, for he cleaned it out and made for the soldier a reasonable little home there. But the man's daughters were not so fond of the arrangements. For the youngest, when her fear had subsided, turned to scorn. At her friends at school, she told them that she had a freak show living in her shed, and how now her father was keeping bears. The eldest refused to even acknowledge the soldier's presence, speaking beyond him whenever she spoke, and when she needed something, she would refer to her father, "The guest in the shed, if you could tell him this or that." But it was the middle daughter, who was the cook of the family, that brought him his meals each morning and night. And there was one day as he sat and smoked before his little home, after setting down his food, she looked at him and said, "Can I bum a smoke?" And he dug one out and handed it to her, and she lit it with a chaste silver lighter that she slipped back in her pocket, and when she'd drawn in the smoke and breathed it out again, she stepped into the cloud. And as she did, he realized that she could not smell him. And then she looked at him and said, "Tell me, what's your story?" And they began to talk. And as their cigarettes grew short, so long grew their tales, and as it happens in fairy tales, day after day, week after week, they sat and they smoked and talked late into the night. They talked of the past and the future. And when he told her his stories, she did not shy away. And winter turned into spring, and the grass sprouted, and the dandelions began to show their heads, and as they did, there was a day when the soldier came to his host, and he pressed into the man's hands a paper bag, and he said, "All last night I counted out money, and there is enough in here to see your business made well again, and your daughters sent back to school." Well, the host protested, saying, "Please, please stay," but the soldier said, "No. I see what I am doing to your family and your business, and I will go. I have lived in the park long enough, and I know its ways." And he went to collect his few things, and as he was, the middle daughter came and watched him. She watched him for a long time before the only words that came from her lips were, Who am I gonna bum cigarettes off now?" And he laughed, and he smiled, and he said, I see how much your sisters hate me, and it is time for me to go. But I have a place in the park. I've lived there long enough, and no, you can't see it. But near enough, there's a bench I like to sit on. Come and visit. We'll talk, we'll smoke, it'll be like here. And she said she would. And before he left, she pressed into his hand that chaste silver lighter that she told him had been her mother's, and he slipped it into the pocket of his coat, and he was off. And he made his life again in the park, and again the rumors began to spread that that bridge was haunted, that beneath it lived a monster, a bear, a creature from whom the stench rolled, and when its nails grew long, it rent them on the concrete pilings to break them short. But during the days, he would sit on his bench, and often, many days that summer, the girl came, and they smoked, and they talked, and their friendship grew. And that fall, when she returned to school on weekends and some weekdays again, she would come. And as it happens in fairy tales, so their friendship grew close. And as Christmas came on, there came a day that he pressed into her hand a stack of bills, saying, "These are for you. Buy your sisters what they wish, and when they love it, tell them only then that it comes from me, and we shall see what we shall see." And she told him later how her sisters had screamed, learning of their dirty, hulking Santa Claus. And January grew in, and then February. And there came a day when he sat on his bench in the park, and it was not his friend that came, but her older sister, who looked him up and down in the snow, and then with scorn dripping in her words, said those words he'd heard 100 times, "Bum smoke." And he handed her a cigarette, lighting it with the chaste silver lighter, and her lips grew tight to see her mother's lighter in his hands. But she took the cigarette, and with the smoke out came her words, full of scorn, saying, "You're ruining her, you know. She won't even look at other boys at school. Our little sister has begun to say to anyone who will listen that it's not men she likes bears. Please, for her sake as much as yours, leave her be." And the girl stormed off into the white, and the soldier ran his hands through his greasy, matted hair, and he walked back to his bridge. He looked down at the ice of the water that flowed beneath the bridge, began to pound it with his fists, tearing at his hair and at his beard, and it was many long days before he returned to the bench. And when he did, in a plastic bag, he found an envelope with a single sheet of paper on which was written a single line, "Where are you?" And he dug deep into the pocket of his coat and drew out a pen, and beneath it wrote, "I have to go away, but I will see you again." He folded it and left it there, and he did not return to that bench for many long weeks. And the solitude grew round him again. And that 7th year was as hard as any that had passed before. And as December came on, he found himself each night walking the paths of the park, looking for who he sought. And it was a night, beneath the light of the moon at that same crossroads, before that same unfrozen pool, that he found the devil, immaculately dressed, his eyes sparkling in the darkness, smoking up at the moon. And the devil smiled to see the soldier come, saying, "Well, aren't you a sight?" The soldier matched the devil's stare for stare, saying, "You said that when this was done, you'd clean me up." "That I did." "Well then, come along." And the devil led him out the park to where sat a beautiful new Cadillac. He opened the door for the soldier and then got behind the wheel, and he drove to the finest hotel in all that city. There they entered the lobby to the screams of the hotel staff, but the devil merely waved his hand, saying, "He is with me," and they quieted. They rode the elevator to the very top floor, and the devil produced the key to the penthouse, and in they went. And the soldier stood stunned in the light and the warmth and the sumptuous beauty around him. And as he stood there, the devil slipped up behind, and as if he was brushing away cobwebs, he slipped that coat from off the soldier's shoulders, and the man staggered as the weight was removed. And then the devil sat him down, and with a pearl-handled shaving razor, shaved him cleaner than he'd ever been before. He produced a pair of scissors, cutting his hair high and tight, leaving matted hunks of greasy dreadlocks strewn around the floor, uncaring. And when he was done, the devil gestured to the washroom, saying, "I can help you if you like, but I imagine you'll want to do it alone." And the soldier made his way to the shower, peeling off the rotting hunks of clothing that had been beneath his coat, and whether or not it was the fine cleaning products of the hotel or the devil's magic, I cannot tell you. But the dirt and the grime and the grease washed away, leaving his skin as pink and clean as ever it had been. And when he returned to the room, there was no sign of the hair and the dirt, and the devil stood by the door with that old green coat over his shoulders, his eyes sparkling. He gestured to the bed where lay a suit, and he said, "In the pockets of that suit, why, they will serve you as well as my coat, and you will find it easier to take it off your shoulders. The keys to the Cadillac are upon the nightstand, and you may stay as long as you like. Our deal is done." And with that, the devil turned and walked from the room, and the soldier crawled into bed, and he slept deeper and darker than he had in 7 long years. And when day arose, he put on those clothes, he put the keys into his pockets, he rode the elevator all the way down, and the hotel staff were happy to wait upon this handsome, obviously rich young man. He ate a fine breakfast, and all that day he found himself driving up and down the coast until as night came, the roads drew familiar, until he came to a 2-story brick building, but it did not seem to sag so much. It was bedecked in greenery and lights in honor of Christmas soon to come. He parked outside, he went in the doors, and behind a counter stood the proprietor's eldest daughter, and she smiled to see the handsome young man before her. He asked for a room and maybe a meal, and she was happy to oblige, and he had never seen smiles like that upon her lips. He sat and he ate, waited on by her youngest sister, who flirted with him, saying sweet things he had never heard from her. He saw them twitter in the corner, but when his meal was done, he rose and went out the back door, where he saw his friend, the middle daughter, leaning against the shed, smoking, looking up at the stars. She turned at the crunch of his feet in the snow, looking at the young man she did not recognize, drew close, saying, "Can I bum a cigarette? I don't have any." She drew one out, handing it to him, but her lips grew tight to see her mother's lighter with which he lit it, but he snapped it closed and handed it to her, saying, "This is yours." She took it in her hand, astonished, looking up at him, looking past the clean cheeks, the clean shave, at those eyes, whose lines she knew and heaviness she recognized, and the tears sprang to her own eyes. She smiled, she laughed, she hugged him in her arms. And when their embrace had finished, he went down upon his knee before her. He reached deep into the pocket of his coat, and when he found what he sought, he drew it out, and in his hand was a golden ring. And he said, "Please, you saw a man when other people saw a beast. My stories, you did not flinch at them. Please, be my wife." And as it happens in fairy tales, and as it sometimes happens in real life, she said yes. And when they went inside, her father wept, embracing the young man, learning who he was. And the soldier smiled inwardly to see the tight lines around her sister's eyes and the smiles they tried to form. But the wedding was planned, and it was a beautiful wedding. And when they left the church, all that family's friends gathered round them, shaking their hands, wishing them long, joyous, prosperous lives. And through that crowd came a man in an immaculate suit, with slicked back black hair and eyes that sparkled in the dying sunlight. And the devil took the soldier by the hand and wished him a long and joyous life. But the soldier tightened his hand and drew him close, saying, "I thought our deal was done." And the devil smiled up at the soldier, saying, "Oh yes, our deal is done, but you may be seeing me yet." And with that, he let his hand go and disappeared into the crowd. And when his new bride turned to him and said, Who was that?" The soldier could only shake his head and mumble, "An old friend, I think."